Hello, and welcome to Strange Stories with the Seeker and the Skeptic. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Ben Stimpson. Ben is an integrative therapist, spiritual director, award winning author, podcaster, and independent scholar of folklore and history. He is the host of Essence Podcast, a weekly show interviewing fellow authors and practitioners in the field of alternative spirituality and therapy. Welcome to the show, Ben. We're very glad to have you.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to it. It's always a good chance to have a good conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, your resume is very impressive. And I was excited to talk to you when I saw that you're an integrative therapist and author, because I'm a licensed clinical social worker. So I consider myself to be a holistic therapist. I try to integrate um, you know, what people often refer to as like shadow work, but like energy work and spirituality into the work that I do with people. So that's kind of where I want to start because that's my interest. So tell me a little bit about like your work as an integrative therapist.
So integrative is the closest the UK has to holistic therapist, similar kind of way of looking at it. So how I operate, and I did my training in Canada, but I work with the UK. I integrate various different modalities. So the five primary ones I'm looking at are Jungian transpersonal. I'm bringing narrative therapy into that, which ties really nicely with Jungian kind of archetype and archetypal psychology. I bring somatics in because of course, how we think and that whole CBT connection of emotion also affects our body. We
Mhm.
tend to hold our emotions in our body and whatnot. And you can tell a lot by looking at, bodily issues, whether it be lower back pain or neck issues. Those tend to be the two common ones. I bring in systems work, so internal family systems and
Yep.
also family systems. So parts work is a big one for me, which again ties in really nicely with archetypal. And then the fifth one is kind of any other modalities. CBT I tend to bring in a lot because of that connection between kind of story, narrative, belief about ourselves, and then emotions and those connection points. So really anything that I can connect in that makes sense, I tend to bring in. Identity piece is a big one too. I tend to work a lot with identity communities. So that's how I work. Yeah.
I love it. Yeah. I mean, I think that you're probably much more of a scholar because you are a researcher.
With this
And
backwards baseball cap? No.
yeah. Than me. But I mean, everything that you're saying that speaks a lot to me. Doing the somatic work is really, really important.
Mhm.
Internal family systems is like my favorite modality ever. It's
Mhm.
so powerful and just, I've actually been through internal family systems therapy because I needed it, but also wanted to learn it so that I could do it with other people
Love it.
and life changing. Absolutely. My entire life is completely different
Mhm.
from before I started. So yeah, I try to get as many people who are open to that. And some people aren't ready, and that's okay because they need to do more of the somatic work, or some more, kind of different level like cognitive restructuring. But I just, sorry, I know this is about.
No, you don't know. You don't. It's completely true. I've noticed that I just reached 1,000 hours in my practice. I first started 5 years ago, and so trying to gain client hours during the pandemic was an issue. So I've just reached my
Yeah.
1,000 hours of client hours, and I have noticed that you can work with any kind of modality. Many modalities really work and operate very similarly. It's just using the kind of it's like different learning methods used by
Mm,
people, right? People learn differently, and so different modalities will work differently for different people. So a lot of people who are more connected in with their bodies and they respond, oftentimes those
yeah.
parts will come out of their bodies, but it'll be like instead of it being, you know, the firefighter up here, the firefighter is actually down here, and it's their
Hmm.
gut, or so it's interesting how those pieces like reassert themselves depending, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think, um, Young, I believe, talked about the shadow, right?
Yeah.
And so A lot of people in like spiritual communities do talk about shadow work. And I think internal family systems is just kind of bridging that from, creating it in a more clinical way, but we're talking about the same thing.
I think so too. I think a lot of people misunderstand what shadow work is.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of them assume that it's all the things that are their traumas. And so they assume
Mm-hmm.
that the shadow work is really wading into their trauma. Well, it isn't. What it is the shadow work is getting through the trauma to the things that they were forced to part with, right? And really trauma, again, people misunderstand what trauma is. People think that trauma is a thing that they have to do, when really it's the thing that you have to unlearn, right? When people are experiencing trauma, it's not the initial traumatic break point that caused the initial trauma or affirmed that initial trauma. It's all of the coping mechanisms that you've
Mm-hmm.
developed to stay safe. Gabor Mate really puts it well in his documentary. Love Gabor Mate, and I think people are starting to wake up to that idea that no, trauma is not something that continually keeps happening to you.
Yeah.
Trauma is how you're responding to how you're perceiving things, right?
Yep. Makes a lot of sense to me. I love it.
Get two therapists in the room together and you
I
just
know. I was like, oh, I'm so excited. Integrative therapist. Yes. So tell us a little bit about like your spiritual journey. You identify as neo-pagan. So tell us a little bit about that and just where did that all start for you?
course. So, and actually, talking about trauma, it started as a trauma response. So,
Okay.
I've talked about this in other podcasts and in my book. So, I'm originally from the UK. I moved to Canada when I was 8 years old, and what I recognize now is that I was dealing with a huge amount of culture shock, and I was in a completely different place. Although you'd think that Canada being very similar to the UK, it isn't. It's very, very different culture-wise. Um, and I had a big hard time with that. So when I was a teenager, when I was in my tweens, I was trying to cope as best as I could by connecting in with anything that reminded me of home. And what I came to realize is, all of the TV shows I grew up with in the UK were so heavily saturated with, King Arthur and Robin Hood and stories of fairy tales and all of these like magical stories that are such a huge part of British culture. Um, and those are the things that I went to and gravitated towards. So folklore became a big important part for me. And where the spirituality piece came in there was I read, or no, I saw the TV movie of the Mists of Avalon when I was very young, 2001, and then I eventually read the book. And at that point in my life, I had come out. I was starting to understand I was gay, and I was in a town of like 18 churches of like 8,000 people in this tiny, tiny little rural
Wow.
Indian town, right?
Hmm.
It was not Schitt's Creek. I wish I had grown up in Schitt's Creek, but I didn't. It was more like Letterkenny, right?
Okay, right.
So I grew up in this like little really conservative place, and so for me then it was like, okay, I'm really grasping still with I really want to be home. This is reminding me of home. This is showing me a spirituality that is grounded in my home, in my homeland. And so I just kind of took it off from there. And then I just became really interested in it. And of course, looking at narrative work, look at most of the TV shows back 20 years, 25 years ago. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Charmed, right? All of these like fantasy TV shows um, that was like, filled with magic. And then suddenly it was like, okay, here's a spirituality that is filled with magic. So there you go. And so it felt comfortable, right? And then when I started getting into the psychology aspect, when I started to look into Jung, when I was a teenager, like older teenager, I was a very angry teenager. So of course I went for really angry, like old psychotherapist types, right? So it started to make sense. So I could start to look at the kind of the spirituality piece as veiled kind of parapsychology and psychology and whatnot. And so it became really interesting to me. And then go figure, I went into studying social work and also religious studies at the same time. So that's how I kind of got into it. When I really started to take ownership of my spirituality was when I started working with a group in my mid-20s, mid to late 20s. That was a ritual group. It was about 150 people altogether, but they
Wow.
would do events of 50 people each. and they were working with Joseph Campbell's monomyth. So what they would do is stage mystery plays based around the monomyth, based around the hero's journey, and we would each take parts in these large ritual stories. And they were quite, it was very similar to LARPing in many ways, which I
Hmm.
also was starting to do around that time too. It was an immersive experience. It was something that was spiritual without necessarily being religious, which was really cool. And it really tied in with, again, that Jungian archetypal piece. So that's kind of all very integrative. Integrative is word of my life, to be honest.
That's interesting. Um, was there like when you were doing kind of those like I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly what you call them, but like ritual plays, was there like an objective to it? Like, was there like we're trying to like create this or set an intention for this, or what was kind of the purpose behind it?
So some of them were objective based. So how it was designed was 7 events throughout the span of 2.5 years. And they were like long weekend, like pagan weekend events. And the rituals would be slotted as part of this ongoing journey. So they were episodes within a story, but they weren't necessarily, they weren't episodic in that way, whereas, last time on the hero's journey,
Hmm.
they were very much tailored to the time of the year, kind of what we were doing as a group. And then there were those elements that brought them together. So like one of the stories was an Imran tale, which were an Imran tale is a type of Irish Odyssey story, like the Odyssey, very similar. So you have a group of people that are casting off into an unknown sea. And as they go through the story, they're encountering islands or spaces that are allegorical. And how are they then, interacting with these allegories? But that story was completely unconnected to the previous year, which was, all about the Beltane blessings, right? So it's
Hmm.
one of those things. It was very tailored to kind of what the group, the unfolding interests of the group. But each story was immersive. There was a storyteller that was telling the story as we were acting it out as a group. We were the audience and also the actors as well. So there was that the fourth wall was not existing. And so we spent, a day kind of preparing to engage in this ritual play. And then it became live action role play. It became a really immersive experience. And then afterwards, we would come together as a group to discuss what was people's experiences in that role,
Hmm.
in that space, while we were also casting magic and this and that and all the others. So, really interesting kind of play there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I've never heard of something like, I mean, I've heard of LARPing before, but just integrating, kind of the ritual elements into it is just really cool.
It's a very old-fashioned, like it's not common. I haven't seen
Hmm.
much. I know other people in North America who do events like this. And because there's a certain sacred element to it too, people don't want to talk too much heavily about it because it's an experience people are going
Hmm.
through, and it's a very meaningful experience.
Sure.
Regardless of how you kind of imagine what's happening, whether or not there's a spiritual element going on, whether or not it's purely a psychological play and entering into psychological play. It's very meaningful and sacred for people. So, people don't generally want to talk about it. But I think that it is very similar to Nordic style LARPing, which is very immersive. Not so much the slash and sword kind of medieval time style that you see in North America. It is very much you are entering into a space and leaving your old self behind, at least for a little while, to be completely in this immersive environment. How are you witnessing yourself acting in this role, as opposed to how are you then, coming forward with this, right?
Hmm.
So. Mhm. I hope any of
That,
that makes sense.
It
yeah, that,
does,
that
yeah.
actually sounds a whole lot like have you ever read the book The Makers by John Fowles?
I
Are you
have,
familiar with
yes.
that?
Mhm.
That
Yeah.
sounds a lot like that, except that you're signing up for it as opposed to having it kind of forced on you.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Yeah.
that's super, super interesting. And so this is something that has gone on in some form or another for a long time then?
I would say so. Yeah, the more I've kind of worked in these spaces, and now I'm like as an author, I'm entering even into even more of these spaces. I would say that it's gone on for a long time. But I would say that culturally speaking, this has gone on for a long time too. Mystery plays have been a very old and ancient form of ritual. You know, when people went to the theater in ancient Greece, oftentimes it was the ritual that they were playing. A lot of the stories that were on stage were, if they weren't, you know, satires, they were more often than not sacred stories, right? And so then how people are engaging with that story as in that space, when people say the magic of the theater, right? It speaks to that. But there were very specific ideas of playing, and mystery plays in particular were really strongly connected with the Christian tradition. You would have roaming bands of players going around Europe and England, and they would be enacting certain mystery plays. And that's the whole idea, is that you can't engage with the mystery by just listening to a story. You have to watch it. You have to be immersive with it. You have to engage with it. And nowadays, this is why we have things like, you know, the nativity pantomimes, for example,
Hmm.
right? You know, it's fun, but when you actually ask people years later, you know, how did that connect in? Oh, it was very meaningful for me. Okay, it touches something much deeper, right?
Hmm.
Mm, yeah, yeah.
I love it. It's very, very interesting. What would you say like your spiritual practices look like now?
Very different from a few years ago. I would say that I'm leaning much more into experiential than I was before. My spiritual practices tend to be a lot more relational. So the relationships that I have with spirits, and I do active spirit work, I relate with spirits a lot more than I did before. A lot of it tends to be ritualistic in nature, again, because of that idea of engaging and immersing
Hmm.
myself in the environment. Ritual for me is in many ways bringing the kind of macrocosm to micro, right? Again, whether or not it's just because of a mental space, or entering into a story, or if it's engaging with reality. I tend to believe that I'm engaging with real entities that are out there, and again, coming back to relationship, um, you know, I'm engaging in multiple ways with the entity as it is now, with my perception of the entity, with the story connected to that entity. I'm also engaging with. So it's a multi-sensory experience. Um, I Ritual work is often a form of communication. So when we look at just how our brains operate, everything in our world is symbolic. You know, you can't walk down a street without looking and reading your surroundings. You know, if I look at John's background there, of course, readers can't see, listeners can't see that, but I can tell a lot by what's in John's background there, telling me a lot about who he is and of what his background is. The same with you, Brittany, right? And of course, you can't tell anything about me because I'm in a white room. But you know, if we were at home right now, you would see my art on my wall. You would be able to see all my books on my bookset, right? So ritual is very much that. You're creating a space that is filled with symbol, and all of those symbols are used to communicate with self, with spirits, with gods, whoever, right? And then you engage in repetitious story, basically, and that is the ritual. So that's kind of a lot of what I do and what I'm interested in, looking at the symbolic, but also the archetypal, and also the reality of it too.
Hmm. What are
Mm-hmm.
some of the entities that you engage with?
Course. So I have various deities that I work with. I've tended to work with deities that I acknowledge have a hand in my life. So two big ones are change and transaction. So in my counseling work, for example, and one of the things about me, I was diagnosed with something called dyspraxia when I was a kid. I had to go through extreme speech therapy. I couldn't speak because I had an issue with coordinating the muscles in my mouth. So communication has always been a big thing for me, whether it's been an issue or whether it's because I use it to express myself in different ways. So Hermes, for example, the Greek god Hermes, a god of communication, I've noticed has been a really important one for me. Another one is change. Change has been a constant thing in my life. Moving to another country, going through various things and phases in my life. Change has been a big thing. So, of course, when I put two and two together and I realized that a lot of the deities and their stories and the archetypes that they kind of inhabit are related to change and destruction and those cycles of destruction and change, it made total sense because it was my lived experience. So Shiva, the Hindu god Shiva, is one that I'm really connected in with. Um, and another key one is fate. So I tend to kind of organize my life around cycles. I've seen in my own life, and I think if I asked anybody, they would be able to do this for themselves. If you were to look at your own life, oftentimes we get into certain cycles. Things seem to come up every 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years for me. That tends to be a big one for a lot of people, right? 5 and 10 seem to be important years. For me, every 2 years seems to be like whenever I've had a big change in my life, it's always been 2 years after another change over and over and over again. 18 months to 2 years. So I work with this idea of change. I work with this idea of the flow of time. And so I have an entity, a deity that I work with around that too. So those are some of them. I work with my ancestors, of course, and that's where my book came from. So my book that I came out with, Ancestral Whispers, working with the family story. So coming back to family systems work, right? Internal family systems work generated from those family connections. And so acknowledging in me that, a certain perfectionism in me comes as a traumatic response from coming from a family culture that was instituted by my ancestors and so on and so on. So working with my ancestors, not as some, far away gone individual who I can't have any connection with or relationship with anymore. Shifting that to, yes, I can have relationship with them now, was a big part of my healing process. And also learning to understand, okay, what's my stuff? What's me? How am I different from this group? And how am I connected? So that I tend to work a lot with ancestor veneration too. And culture too. So some of the entities of culture, certain founders of towns, the idea of the UK as a landscape, but also as a deity, I tend to work with because I'm from there. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. There's so much to it.
There is. No, it's very interesting. I love listening to everyone's different take and practices and just like how, your relationship with different entities. Do you like, I'm trying to figure out how to like ask the question. Do you channel them? Do you feel like you are like receiving information from them in a certain type of way? Like, do you have a certain like Claire that's stronger than others? How does that kind of like relationship look like for you?
I think it depends on the type of entity, right? I am a believer in spiritual communication. I do believe that. But I think that it's dependent upon what my lens is of what constitutes that communication, right? So deities, as I said, some of the ones I work with, they tend to have a hand in my life because I see their work in my life, right? Changes happening. So they're less kind of sentient beings as opposed to kind of aspects of reality with a face, right? So then the communication I have is then how I respond to or react to things that are happening in my life, right? And that's also understanding what is my stuff in that, how have I instituted that, what is mine versus what is a natural part of reality, right? And then that communication is a lot more covert, it's a lot more symbolic, it's a lot more less the type of communication that we would have as human beings. With ancestors, it is prayer, it is going to various sites, it is that a lot more of that spiritual communication one-on-one because they were when they were living, they communicated like that. So whether it be speaking to a psychic or speaking to them through a psychic or a medium, something like that, holding a seance, right? But again, seeing them as having a hand in my life. And I do come from a tradition where ancestors have direct hands and ability to influence the world. So it's looking at kind of how are they communicating, maybe in a symbolic way, maybe in a less linear way, and becoming very what's the word? Aware of non kind of linear communication. Somatics also comes into it. So this is less about communication, more about just how I flow with the world.
Mhm.
But knowing that, when I'm entering a time in my life that seems to be impacted by something much bigger than me, I feel it in my body, whether or not I become um, more aware of kind of the things going on around me that are not as visible that the five senses are telling me. So I tend to become nervous. I tend to have butterflies in my stomach, and I know when that is something to do with kind of trauma or something that I'm dealing with, or something coming out of my brain, probably because of my training. And when it's just unrelated and seems to be related to other things, that Jungian idea of synchronicity really becomes a big piece in that, right? So I feel it in my body. And through retrospect, I'm like, okay, that makes sense. I've had times in my life where, a big decision was happening in my life that I didn't have privy to. It was like, what's been happening behind the curtain. But I knew something was happening behind the curtain because I had butterflies in my stomach.
Mhm.
I just had this sense that something bigger was happening and that I had an important decision to make, or I need to just step out of the way and just let it happen. And as I've attuned to that, I've become a lot more aware. And in retrospect, then it all falls into like the little weird coincidences fall into place, and I'm like, so that's what that was, right? You know. So I can give an example of that if you'd like.
I would love an example. Sure.
Okay. So a few years ago, I had not a few years ago, about 5, 6, 7 years ago. I had a year where all of these people came back into my life. There were about 7 of them, and each one of them I had unfinished business with. They were guys who I had a romantic connection with, or I felt some sort of, like one was my best friend. We had a falling out a few years earlier, and uncanny things would happen. Like I would re-meet them through completely weird, like weird, bizarre things. So with my best friend, I thought that he was living in California, and I didn't expect to see him ever again. So I moved to a small city just outside of Toronto. I was starting my psychotherapy training, and I became aware because he popped up on Facebook one day. Like his profile came up on people you may know. I hadn't seen it for ages, and I was like, wait, it was so weird. So I of course went and I looked as you do, right? And it turns out he was living in the same city I was living in. I was like, that's weird. So we reconnected, and it took about 2 years to reconnect. But then when we did, suddenly all these pieces fell into place. It turns out his office that he had been working at was 5 minutes around the corner from where I was living. Turns out that he was seeing the therapist who was literally next door to me in the same row in the hallway when I was doing my practicum training, right? At the same time. So we were going to bump into each other, right?
Yeah.
It turns out that he had dated somebody I had also dated in the same city, right? All of these pieces, and I didn't even think. Like it was so bizarre. Like all of like it was so bizarre. And you often see this. A lot of people have those weird coincidences when that takes place. My favorite one is there's a couple in China. There was a story about them that they were flipping through old family photos, and they came across a photo of her 10 or 15 years earlier at this tourist site in like Sichuan or somewhere in China, where and they were shocked because it's her in front of this big massive statue of Mao or something like that, and he's in the background also having his photo taken,
I
right?
love that.
They didn't know each other. They were
Yeah.
completely different, like different cities, and they only met each other a few years later. And you often hear about this, like people saying, "Oh yeah, my wife was on the same military base as me, and we just never crossed paths. We always knew, like we knew people, but we never crossed
Hmm.
paths." And then they meet years later, and it's like, what? So that's when I know, okay, I had a feeling that was going on. Something big was happening around me, and I didn't know. And then suddenly, in retrospect, it all makes sense. So that's very much a form of communication. Yeah.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, it's the subtle communication. And sometimes it's like, can you just be a little bit more clear?
Yeah.
What are you trying to tell me? Uh,
I think it's interesting, and a lot of things you're saying kind of goes into some of the things that I've been kind of thinking myself recently. Like most, like a lot of the different like supposedly alternative styles of thinking about this type of stuff. Um, like for example, like you talked about the mystery plates that you participate in. I mean, basically, I mean these are initiation machines.
Mhm.
Rituals are initiation machines. It all leads to synchronicities, and synchronicities lead to more initiations, which lead to more synchronicities. And so it is really the more people that I talk to, and through this and through other means, and the more books I read, and the more shows like Hellier and stuff that I watch, um, I think that all of these things are really different parts of the same thing,
Mhm.
and I think that it's the universe trying to engage us in experience, and I think that the experience is kind of the point. And I think that what you're showing that you've gone through on this, it's kind of for me is giving me some positive reinforcement to some of those thoughts.
Mhm. Yeah, I really hear what you're saying there. I think that this gets into those bigger questions, right? The bigger questions of like, what is the reason and purpose for all of this, right? The complexity of reality, the complexity of life, the complexity of our emotions, right? And this is, I really get this when I work as a therapist because I'm sitting in front of clients and the neurotic kind of issues that we get ourselves into and all of that, right? I love it. Um, it can't be by chance. That being said, I don't know if it's necessarily an intelligence that we can understand.
Hmm.
It's not some bearded old white guy in a boat saying from a cloud, thou shalt have light, right? I don't think of it in
Yeah.
that way. But I do think that there's an intelligence. I do think there is an undercurrent of intelligence. Um, and I do think that um, like I am a believer of reincarnation. I do believe that we come back again and again, and to experience. And I think that then that is why we tend to forget, because what's the point if we just remember everything from life to
Hmm.
life to life, right? Um, I think that this is why we also forget, even within our own lives, certain things, certain lessons, because that lesson will come again and reassert itself again and again, right? Um, I think that the relationships that we build, whether with entities, whether with ourselves, whether with other people, regardless of who or what, relationship is really important because relationship tests us. Relationship can is that ground of what are we doing, right? And so I see the whole of reality as relationship, and depending upon kind of what philosophy you take to that, the external is also the internal, and vice versa, right? I've noticed that when I've engaged with these mystery players, it's a transformative experience just by itself. I come out a different person than I go in. When you talk about initiation rites around the world, one of my major interests, and I'm actually just finished a BA in history and religious studies and classical and medieval studies. When you look at all of those cultures, one of the recurring things is that initiation is death. So people go into initiation and the old dies and a new person is born. We often see this also in therapy too, right? It's
Hmm.
that descent of the goddess into the underworld and coming out again. We see this in cyclical. And I think that's why paganism is so interesting to me, because it speaks to so many of those pieces. I would say that when you look at all world religions, they speak to those same issues because that's the human condition, right? You know, I really do think that religion is one way of communicating it. But what's interesting is that when we look at contemporary culture, people are finding alternatives to religion, but they're saying the same thing, right? So video games, I'm really interested in the connection between video games, LARPing, fandom, and therapy. That's something I'm really, really interested in, because what is a deity to one could be a superhero to another. And for those who aren't interested in a spiritual or a religious relationship, they still have relationships of a very similar kind to their video game characters, to their superheroes, to their heroines or heroes from literature, right? The number of people who read like Jane Austen and really connect in with Elizabeth Bennet and think Mr. Darcy is a complete fucking idiot, right? It tells that relationship tells you a lot about that individual, where they're at, right?
Hmm.
What their needs are. And so I love it. I think it's really interesting. And LARPing is really like that too. When you look at a lot of people who LARP and you ask them, tell me about your first character when you first started LARPing, and every single one of them will admit that really who that first character was themselves, just with a different face, right? As they started to explore themselves, their characters started to take on different aspects, and those were aspects that they were really interested in becoming, right? In the same way that initiation, you become something else in through initiation, right?
I
Mm-hmm.
feel like that's very similar. What you just said about LARPing is very similar for a lot of writers who write fiction. Like when you're first writing fiction, it's really kind of like through your very, personalized lens. But the more that you create, it's like the more you explore different aspects of humanity,
Oh, it's
you
true.
know? And I feel like a lot of what you're talking about in terms of like the storytelling and the relationships and that kind of exploration is just about people trying to make meaning of their experiences and just trying to understand the all of it, all the different dimensions of it.
Very much so. Very much so. And if you pay attention to writers, you can see that. If you watch Anne Rice, for example, at the kind of the journey of Lestat, you can see when Anne Rice was dealing with issues because Lestat
Hmm.
became very, very religious, right? So,
Yeah.
but it's true. It's true. And
Yeah.
and the relationship with those characters, this is the interesting thing. I think this is why so many, particularly the pagans, are also fantasy writers and writers in
Hmm.
general. A friend of mine, Morgan Daimler, who is a prolific writer in for fairy literature and fairy lore. They're a folklorist, but they're also a urban fantasy writer. And we were chatting about what's the relationship like when I had her on my podcast. We were talking about what's the relationship like between your characters and then these fairies that you're interacting with in other spaces. And they said, when you get into, and a lot of writers say this, when you get into working with those characters, you start to hear those characters. They start to take shape in your head. They start to become sentient in a way, and they will inform you what they want. And it's interesting because Jung talked about this too. There's, I believe it was, he was writing, about a particular spirit that he was talking to, and the spirit was his own invention, completely invented this spirit. But eventually, what happened was he started to even see this spirit. The spirit became so real to him that it would be in his writing corner when he was writing, and this spirit was like the epitome of his writing, right? And I think that speaks a lot to the power of the human mind, whether or
Hmm.
not it was an actual spirit or whether or not it was something the mind created. I think that really tells us the depths of our own abilities, right? Um, so again, is it real? Is it not real? I know this is a skeptic show and it's a believer show. I don't know if that necessarily matters. I think what is the relationship? And that's how I often work with clients, especially clients who are, perhaps dealing with mental illness, right? What is the relationship that that client has with a hallucination that they're dealing with?
Hmm.
Right? That's more important to me than necessarily the fact that they're hallucinating or
Yeah.
not, right? Yeah.
Yep. And I mean, what you just described about Jung and your friend, it's to me that's very much like a thought form or a tulpa, right? Like the mind is creating something into this dimension of reality,
Exactly.
and so and I'm with you too about when you're doing therapy, it's less about what's objectively real, like because how can we say what is objectively real? And I think a lot of times there's people who are branded with mental illness, and are they just connecting into something else that other people can't see, sense,
This is it.
experience themselves?
This is it, right? I mean, 150 years ago, AFAB people, women, were told that they were insane if they had
Hmm.
indigestion, right? Like that was the overarching kind of reality that the
Yeah.
culture was living in. it really does show you how much culture determines kind of how we even see this idea of reality.
Yeah.
And I think that as we go forward, especially with the AI situation that we have going on, that's really going to be tested a lot in the Western world here, right? What is consciousness? What
Mm-hmm.
is personhood? What is sense of sentience? What is it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that'll be interesting. But again, it has to come back to relationship, right? You know?
Mm-hmm.
Mm, mhm,
I mean, when it comes to the connection between writing and all this stuff, I mean, Alan Moore has said multiple times that there was a time, I think it was like in the late '90s, that he encountered John Constantine, which is a
mhm,
fictional character that he made up in his head. But he's not the only person who's written that character who is said to have had that experience. And I mean, yeah, Alan Moore is kind of an out there dude, but like he said it in a way that wasn't like he wasn't messing around. It's a thing
mhm,
that he has happened to him. I mean, right now I'm writing a novel that started out as a series of dreams that I'm writing through tarot tarot sessions before every
wow.
time I do a writing session. And I mean, it's the words are mine, but the story I'm telling, it's not coming from me. It's coming from something, but it's not coming from me.
Right,
I
right.
mean, and I'm someone with no real solid belief system. I very much I try to be open to things, and I believe people have the experiences that they say that they have. But as far as like, like a guidebook or something, like I don't belong to a religion or anything.
Mhm,
Um, so without that kind of thing to say, well, this is coming from, you don't have to have that to have those things happen to you, for one thing. But for me to experience what I'm experiencing in writing, I can't say that all this other stuff's not there as well.
it's a question of, again, what criteria are we calling real, right? And this
Mm-hmm.
is the thing, that sense of what reality is. That's a perfect example, right? Coming from your dreams and you're working on it, but it feels like it's coming from outside. Um, so a phenomenon that we often see in the pagan community is we it's going to sound ridiculous to people who are not part of these traditions, but we tend to go through phases where certain deities are more popular than others, and particularly in the gay pagan community, that's very quick. Like there's a really quick turnaround. Every 2 years, there's a new deity that people are really interested in, and that speak to the queer experience, right? Kali, Hecate, Ceridwen, right? Santa Muerte became a big one, and now we're starting to look at Welsh deities again, right? And it seems like every year, what happens is there are people who are practitioners who are putting stuff onto social media, right? And really showing and showcasing something, and people are watching that and seeing that, and then suddenly they start to experience dreams of these deities coming to them, right? Saying you're chosen, or I really want you, or baby, come to me, whatever it is, right? And I'm not criticizing this at all, but it is an interesting interplay between the psychology and the kind of, what is there something bigger happening here? My theory of what's going on is both, right? The more people are seeing something in the culture around them, the more they're taking that in, it's going into their subconscious, and it's going to come back out of their subconscious again, often connected with desires, right? So, we know this just from cognition. People tend to focus and see what's right in front of them when they're either expecting it or when they're looking for it, right? So for some of these, quite a lot of these individuals in the gay pagan community, right, there is a genuine desire, a want, a need to either be included, to feel authentic, to want to have a practice that is fulfilling whatever their needs are. They tend to be very similar. And then they see people that they're looking up to creating altars to these spirits, and so subconsciously, there's a desire, I want that too. I want whatever this is, because it feels really cool. I want it too. Subconscious comes back up again as dream. Now, whether or not that's the deity suddenly being like, oh, yes, I see you. I see you and you see me. I'm coming for you. I'm going to appear in a dream. Or whether or not it's the dream is creating because of that need coming out of the subconscious. Big question. Not my place to answer that. Everybody needs to answer that for themselves. But that does speak again to that relationship, and it comes back to relationship, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's when the power of the mind becomes really big, because the power of the mind, to be able to even dream is a huge part of the power of the mind. That's powerful, right? And we're finding out we're not the only ones. Octopus dreams, little mice dream, everybody dreams, right? So at that point, then, is it just neurons kind of misfiring at night, or is it something bigger, right? Mm, I don't know the answer, but I have my theories that I'm going to keep to myself. But I have my theories. Yeah.
I mean, I've thought since I was like a little kid that there was some kind of connection with dreams and people as a mass. And I would say like I would be like 8 years old and say something as my parents, they would be like, "Go play." They just didn't quite expect that out of an 8-year-old, I guess. But it's always kind of been something that I've experienced in dreams and things that seem to be more than what we think it should be. Like and as adults, as things seem limited to us, I think we kind of limit ourselves
Mhm.
that what we think is possible.
Hmm.
And because we want answers, and I try really hard not to want answers. Crowley would
I
call it
want
like the
answers.
lust, the lust for results, as Crowley would say. It is kind of something that because that can stop you
Mhm.
in a way.
Yeah, and I mean, looking at Crowley's life, right? Like he grew up with a father who was handing him answers, and he seemed to enjoy those answers up until a point where they suddenly became too restrictive, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I mean, the answers that he went searching for were really aligned with his own will. It's he's an interesting case study of that. And I mean, he had a very strange relationship with psychology in the first place. He saw it and understood it as being useful, but he also hated it too because it had a tendency to limit as well, right? So yeah. I think this is why we look at children's literature and children's, like, so much of children's stories are fantasy. And then
Hmm.
somewhere along the way, maybe when puberty hits, we suddenly just like, oh, that's not cool anymore. And we're, hyper focused on restrictive socialization. And I think that people have a real want to explore that again. I think that's why LARPing, why, any kind of fandom where RPG and where magic, often so many people are aligned in both communities, right? I think that they're serving the same need to explore and to open up again so that we have
Hmm.
that space to answers, and seek those answers.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I have a question, obviously. So my question is, do you think that the different entities that people connect with, that you connect with, are they all actually different? Or are they all from different frequencies from maybe one source?
Yes.
Hmm.
That's the question I try to grapple with all the time.
Okay.
I do think both, because it's not an either or for me.
Okay.
One of the traditions that I practiced and worked with was a Cuban-based tradition, Santeria, Lukumi, and the way that their theology is structured is there is a white light that, through a prism, becomes different colors, and those different colors then become connected with different parts of reality. So in their theology, we have the Orishas, the spirits of the landscape. So they come down to earth and they become connected with certain landscape features. They live lives as humans. They become the fabric of reality, right? Um, that story very similar to, say, the Silmarillion, the idea of Lord of the Rings. Eru Ilúvatar, God creates all these spirits that then come and inhabit the world and become the world, right? I think that many ways spirits are like that. You've got various spheres and various circles of reality. We in this fleshy sphere are different, but when we really look at it, there's so many things that make us similar, right? We are individuals, but we're also extensions of our family culture. Us as personalities are extensions of our family culture. going back and back and back, right? To the point that if we look at our families, eventually we're connected to everybody. So I think
Mhm.
that it really depends on kind of how we're looking at it. If
Mhm.
you zero in too much, yes, it looks like we're individuals. If you zero out, it starts to become fractal. And I think that spirits are like that too. I really do think that the the connections in the spiritual world and other parts of reality become less three-dimensional as we exist, right? So, I often, when interacting with spirits, I will allow them, well, it's not even now I will allow them, I will just take them as they come, right?
Mhm.
So if they're coming as
Sure.
an individuated spirit, sentient spirit, then that's who they are. They may be connected in with the other spirit that I work with in ways that even I don't know, maybe ways they don't even know. But I will take them as they come, in the same way that I expect people to take me as I come, right? So I have individual practices, individual rituals, individual altars, individual shrines to all of these different individuated personalities. Um, and oftentimes I've experienced them as individual sentient personalities. But there's also that understanding that they, again, just like me and all of us here, we can be connected in different ways. So they may be part of one greater source that eventually, just becomes everything, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, I don't like to be too rigid with that because when I have
Yeah.
done in the past, I've had my ass handed to me, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I joked a minute ago saying I wanted the answers, but like I'm with you, like in Jonathan of it's best to just keep it open-minded. My beliefs from a couple years ago have expanded, and I think that's how it's supposed to be,
Yeah.
of like we're not meant to be rigid. We are meant to be fluid beings and continuously learning and growing and experiencing in different ways.
This is the thing. We allow change to grow then, or at least we acknowledge that change is happening then, right? I
Hmm.
think there's also a tendency with universalism to strip away the language, the relationship, the communication, right? You often see this with kind of like new agey, lighty sort of types where they're like, well, it doesn't matter, everything's the same, everything's one God, all gods are one God, all gods are one goddess. And what you're essentially doing there is you're stripping each of these deities of the personality that they exist within,
Hmm.
and causing harm to the cultures that have relationship with those. So very good. I mean, cultural appropriation comes up with this, right?
Hmm.
People who in my line of work with ancestor work, right, they'll look at the movie Coco, for example. There's a need there, coming back to that idea of needs. There's a real desire there for connection with where we come from, with our ancestors, with family, right? Those people who we know we directly come from in one way. And so what happens is people start putting up ofrendas and shrines and start practicing in this way using a very specific cultural modality of the Chicano and Southern Mexican people, right? And in with using symbols that only really make sense to that group of ancestors and
Hmm.
in that culture. And yes, they have a desire to want to connect with their own ancestors that way. But if your ancestors are from Europe, right? If like me, if you have British ancestors, then they're not going to, like, marigolds are not a connected part of that culture, right? Marigolds don't make sense as a symbol, and neither does building shrines or whatnot in that way. And so what you're essentially doing then is you're just saying, no, I get to own this because I want it. It doesn't matter what you're doing, and you do cultural harm to
Hmm.
those, that culture that has continued and flourished and that holds that as a secret story. It would be like entering into a play you haven't paid a ticket for and expecting for the actors to play for you. And
Hmm.
it doesn't work like that, right? You know, yeah. Anyway, soapbox moment.
Nope, it was a very important, I think, perspective because I think you're right. Like, even just like with different, energy clearing practices and smudging and stuff like that, like that can be a sense of a cultural appropriation that people need to be mindful of and
Very much
and
so.
careful.
Yeah. But it like when I say cultural appropriation, I think we really need to understand a little bit deeper with what's happening with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because culture is a current, because culture is a form of relationship, and culture is a form of identity,
Mm-hmm.
right? There are parts of culture that everybody has that is so subconscious that they don't even realize. I'm starting to realize that now as I plan to move back to the UK, how
Mm-hmm.
North American I am because I grew up here, right? How direct I am, how some of my phrases don't make any sense over there. Like if I were to, talk about Letterkenny, for example,
Mm-hmm.
being from Ontario here, of course, a lot of North Americans know what Letterkenny is and Schitt's Creek is. Not a lot of Europeans do, right? So a lot of that cultural, like, kind of sense of belonging is there. What cultural appropriation does is it says that an outsider is entitled to a sense of belonging and a form of relationship that they didn't earn,
Mm-hmm.
they don't have. And if they try to take that sense of belonging and put it towards their own, like, ancestral relationships or their own spiritual relationships, then if we see these beings as sentient beings, right, then you're stripping away their consent in engaging in a relationship with you because it feels cool to you, right? It
Mm-hmm.
makes something two-dimensional that's really seven-dimensional, right? You know, yeah, very dangerous, very dangerous.
Yep.
It's an
So
important
tell,
conversation to have.
yeah, it definitely is.
Mhm.
You have a second book coming out, so tell us a little
Mhm.
bit about the premise of the second book. What's
Of
that
course.
all about?
So the second book, I'm really, really interested. It was really tied into where I came from with folklore. So the first book was a how-to guide of how to build ancestral relationship through a spiritual practice. The second book and the third book, and now working on the sequel to it, is pure folklore. And what I've done is I've gone into the folklore record to pull out the stories of magicians, cunning folk, and witches of mostly England and Wales. And I'm working on Scotland and Ireland now, and really to demonstrate that I wanted to demonstrate several things. First of how connected story is with landscape and how that folklore element works. We often think of story as just story, but when you really look at it, most stories is connected with landscape. And that speaks to us about the fourth wall, right? We can place ourselves within these worlds when we are, connecting it in with the landscape. So I took 220 stories, 220 figures, I should say, from the landscape of England and Wales. And I looked at the stories that were being told of them. So it's a folklore book, folk tales, but also I wanted to illustrate how those tales have changed over the centuries. So I can only really look at the textual record, but I list the different versions of these tales and how they've changed over the centuries. One of my favorite examples is and I had a great time with some of these stories because some of them are so ridiculous, but they tell you a lot about the culture of those times. One of my favorites is there's a glacial rock in a churchyard in Lancashire, in just north of Manchester in England there. And the local understanding is that underneath that rock is buried a witch. So there was a witch named Meg Skelton, and she was buried, and she was the Witch of Plumpton, and she was buried under there because she was so evil that they had to put a stone on top of her grave, right? And they buried her upside down so that if she tried to claw out, she would be clawing down into hell, right? Now, Meg Skelton, one of her primary stories is that she would steal milk, and this is like, I've not seen this in any of the other stories I found, but she would steal milk in a pitcher from her neighbors through magical means. She turned this pitcher into a goose that would waddle behind her. And one day, somebody was passing on the road, and the goose got too close to it, so it just he just hoof kicked the pitcher. Didn't realize that it was an actual pitcher and thought it was a goose, and it broke, and the milk went everywhere. Now, there are 5 different versions of that story over the span of 150 years, and they change throughout those retellings. So that if you open a book now with that story in, you often get the newest version of it, but all of the other previous versions just they keep adding little details. So I really wanted to showcase that how even with the culture that we have and the stories that we think are set in stone, how they've evolved over time. So it was really cool. And again, like you really get a sense of like, the old guy or the old woman sitting by the fire in a pub or in the
Hmm.
armoire and telling these stories to, on cold winter nights. You just get that feeling of culture and that coziness, and it's just great. So I had a lot of fun. It's going to be a big book. It's going to be about 7 inches by 8, like by 10 inches. So it's going to
Hmm.
be a big, thick book. And it was 180,000 words. So it's a really
Oh, wow.
packed,
Yeah.
really good source book. And then people can look in and look. And because it's designated by area and name, so a lot of people, if they wanted to, can go around the landscape if they go over to England or Wales and be like, okay, I'm going to go to that
Ah,
cemetery because that's where I think
cool.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's coming out in June 2025, and I'm working on the sequel now, which hopefully will come out 6 months later if I can get in. Yeah.
Awesome. Where can people find you on the internet? Where's your podcast?
Yes,
Tell
of
us all
course.
that.
So everything's on benstimpson.com.
Okay.
That has my all my podcasts, all my books, all my other work on there. And if people are interested in the counseling aspect, benstimpsoncounseling.co.uk is where they can find me on there.
Awesome.
Cool.
Well, this has been a very interesting conversation. I have enjoyed it very, very much. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us and just exploring all of these wonderful topics with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. It was nice. And I have to ask, so
Yeah.
you've both kind of like alluded to it. So which one's the skeptic and which one's the believer here?
So I'm the seeker. So I'm the more spiritual one of us. I'm very spiritual. And Jonathan is the skeptic, but I'll let him tell you what he thinks skeptic means.
Oh yeah, I just feel like it's a term that's kind of been co-opted by debunkers over the years, and it just has always bothered me because what a skeptic is supposed to be is somebody who has just wants more information, just asks questions. And so, like like I said, before, if somebody has had an experience, they've had an experience. I'm not the person to say that you have not had the experience that you had. What I think is likely in a lot of situations, and this has happened in my own life as well, is sometimes uh, we draw conclusions where we don't have enough information to really draw a conclusion.
Right.
Like, you've got somebody who can see a light that they can't find a source for immediately and call it an angel or God or an alien or their neighbor Fred.
Right.
And when you don't have enough data to really make an assertion and you still make an assertion, that's where skepticism should come in and be like, well, I don't really know, what this is. And I read a lot. I've watched a lot. And I've talked to a bunch of people, and more now, having done the podcast and stuff. And the more I learn, the more I think it's important to tell people we don't have enough information for most of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. That wasn't a gotcha. I was just curious. I was like, ooh.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So I appreciate that. Well,
Yeah,
thank you so much for having me on. I would love to do this again sometime. And
absolutely.
Absolutely.
thank you.
Yep, we'll definitely be checking out your books and your podcast. And yeah, we would love that. We'd love to talk. Thank you so much for being here. If you have a strange story you want to share with us, email us at seekerandskeptic@gmail.com. We look forward to talking to you soon.